Hello, and welcome to this lecture series on cybersecurity. In this course, we will cover hacking, espionage, terrorism, and warfare. My name is Craig Jarvis. I'm an international and cybersecurity researcher. I split my time between industry, where I work as a threat intelligence specialist, and academia, where I guest lecture at several universities, whilst also writing a book on cyberterrorism. This course is designed to give you a thorough grounding in how hacking is being used to achieve a variety of geopolitical objectives. Whilst this course examines a technical subject matter, it is not a technical course, and there are no prerequisites. This program comprises 7 modules. Firstly, the Security in the Digital Age lecture will provide you with an overview of how the internet is impacting international security. We will go back to the inception of the internet and chart its evolution. We will examine how the disciplines of espionage, sabotage, influence and terrorism digitized, creating an array of new threats for societies to manage. The second lecture explores cybersecurity. Digital technologies underwrite modern nations. We will analyse how defences are provided to individuals, companies and countries to enable them to thrive despite the internet often being a hostile environment. We will then examine how the culture of hacking has evolved over the decades, starting with students in 1950s computer labs and tracing their evolution into the hackers of today. We will study the anatomy of hacking, dissecting how attackers conduct their operations from first identifying their target to achieving their ultimate objectives of perhaps stealing data or destroying equipment. The 5th lecture takes us into the shadowy realms of cyber espionage as we analyse how nation-states have used hacking to gain covert intelligence. We also study how traditional and hacking-based intelligence capabilities complement and compete with one another. Our cyber warfare lecture takes a deep dive into how hacking is used in the prelude to conflict and during the hostilities themselves. We focus in particular on the Russia-Ukraine theatre, as that has been an incubator for the use of hacking during warfare. Finally, we analyse cyber-terrorism to understand how extremists are using the internet and how hacking techniques are enabling them to pursue their strategic goals. Specific attention is given to the Hamas-Israel conflict. In summary, this programme will provide you with an initial overview of cyber's impact on international security and will serve as a strong foundation for further study. Let's get started by going back to the birth of the internet with security in the digital age. Hello and welcome to this lecture on security in the digital age. My name is Craig Jarvis. I'm a researcher focusing on international and cyber security. I'm a guest lecturer at Royal Holloway and Oxford, and I'm currently writing a book on cyberterrorism. This lecture will go back to the start of the digital revolution. We will examine the birth of the internet and how cybersecurity developed in response to early threats. We will understand how surveillance and privacy was impacted by the emergence of new technologies and how criminals, spies and saboteurs thrived in this new environment. We will examine how influence operations transitioned from offline to online and hybrid, and how terrorists operate in the digital realm. Finally, we will explore the future of the internet and the threats that we will have to deal with in the coming years. Firstly, we should understand what we mean when we talk about cyberspace. It is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as the notional environment in which communication over computer networks occurs. Think about your phone, your smartwatch, your laptop, the computer servers of the company you work for, your digital TV. They all exist on the internet, this network that we all share, and it is that space, that shared environment, that we consider to be cyberspace. So let's examine cybersecurity. Over the rest of this lecture, we are going to use this timeline to plot how the internet has evolved. Now, the internet originated in 1969 when a group of men gathered at the University of California, Los Angeles. They were funded by the Defense Department's Advanced Research Project Agency, ARPA. And their idea was to connect together room-sized computers at 4 different academic institutions so that one user could log into a computer at another facility and vice versa. They were trying to share computing resources to minimize costs. It was the birth of the internet, but that name would not be used for many years. In those early days, it was called the ARPANET. Whilst there is a degree of contestation regarding the internet's origin story, the dominant narrative is that the military's interest in the academic project was in its potential application as a nuclear command and control network resilient to Soviet strikes. The ARPANET was being designed to route around network damage and find alternative routes to deliver its traffic. Therefore, if a nuclear impact destroyed the data link between two intermediary locations, the ARPANET would find another route for the military command and control traffic to traverse, ensuring the ability to execute strike orders. Not long after the internet started to develop, the first virus emerged, Creeper. It was not a malicious virus, but a proof of concept. And it was not long after this that the first security product, Reaper, evolved. And as we go on through the 70s and 80s, we see the internet starting to take shape, and more viruses, such as worms against nuclear killers, emerged. We also saw antivirus developing in the 80s and denial of service attacks. Security hadn't been a major consideration in the early decades of the internet's evolution. The community using the network mostly knew one another, and it was primarily an academic tool that even by the 1970s was connected to fewer than 100 universities. If there was a security issue, the engineers would call whomever was responsible for the associated infrastructure and collaborate to fix it. The notion that the internet would be the nexus of our lives and would need robust security was comprehended by few. Today, we are in a perpetual cycle of offensive and defensive sparring. This has continued for the last half century and shows no sign of stopping. In 1989, the World Wide Web was born. This allowed the commercialization of the internet, as people could now experience the internet not just through a command line, but through a browser. Companies like Amazon and Google soon emerged. The internet had been left to evolve under neoliberal principles, with minimal regulation, free markets and open societies. Yet these doctrines often lead to the exploitation of the citizen in favour of the corporation. Shoshana Zuboff believes that the commodification of personal data for profit by monopolistic corporations amounts to surveillance capitalism. Remember, if you're not paying for the product, you most likely are the product. Your data, at least. When people receive free services, they often don't question the motives of the providers or the societal implications of a market where people are commoditised, their data sold to enable targeted advertisements. Bruce Schneier argues that surveillance is the business model of the internet, something we will explore further in the next slide. One of the other challenges of the internet is that it is often an echo chamber. Search algorithms are not focused on providing you access to opposing expert views on a topic, as a professional reporter may be. They instead offer confirmation bias, preventing views that often align to those of the user, reinforcing rather than challenging existing perspectives. This confirmation bias is as a result of algorithms being orchestrated for maximum user engagement. The more engagement, the more time the user is on the site, the more advertisements that can be served, and the more profit generated. Engagement is highest when emotions are highest, when outrage and conflict dominate. Extreme opinions often garner the most engagement, so that we have seen them rise to the top of search results, influencing mainstream opinion in a way that wouldn't have been possible before the World Wide Web. There have been profound implications for surveillance and privacy in the digital age. During the early internet, there were two main schools of thought on how the internet would impact society: cyber-utopianism and cyber-dystopianism, or pessimism. It was also known during the period as techno-utopianism and dystopianism. Cyber-utopianism was the theory that the internet would advance democracy, liberty and human rights. The cyber-utopians believed that once humanity became interconnected, it would be able to erode the sense of otherness that curated conflict and embark upon collaborations across borders, languages, and cultures for the common prosperity of humankind. They believed knowledge and education would become democratized and accessible to all. They believed that in the new world, autocrats would not be able to maintain power, as the citizenry would be able to freely express their opinions from behind the digital shield of encryption and anonymity software. Citizens would be able to unite and organise online, puncturing autocratic propaganda and systems of power. They believed societies would become more decentralised, educated, egalitarian and democratic. The cyber dystopians believed that the internet would increase government repression. They believed that digital technologies would enable an age of mass surveillance, that it would erode privacy, dehumanise citizens, and increase social fragmentation as humanity neglected its real-world relationships. This theory was strongly influenced by works such as George Orwell's 1984, where technology was used to surveil entire populations and enforce social conformance. In fact, an entire category of literature, cyberpunk, from where the Matrix movies originated, exists that orients around the themes of lone hackers confronting evil governments in a dystopian future. Some of the most prescient in society who were able to foresee these dangers were also those developing technologies to counteract them. Public key encryption was first developed in 1975. Its authors included those who were worried about government surveillance, but who also wanted to be able to move secure communications online. However, in the 1970s and 1980s, public key encryption was incredibly computationally expensive, so it was only implemented in the highest of threat groups, such as within the financial sectors and government institutions. By the 1990s, the internet and web were becoming increasingly popular, and government started to worry about how they may be able to manage security online. One approach was building in surveillance within the internet's architecture. The Clinton administration in the US proposed key escrow, whereby computer chips would include backdoors for government agencies. This proposal was in existence for several years before it finally ended, likely because of industry's protests that if a US government backdoor was installed in every US laptop or US technology, then foreign markets would be closed to them. The Chinese had a different approach. They had a strong hold on information domestically, but were worried about their citizens accessing foreign information. They built the Great Firewall to enable them to filter traffic so that their citizens only saw what they wanted them to see. This continues to be in existence today and is considered very successful. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, encryption's rollout continued to move slowly. As populations came online, security did not keep pace, leading to the golden age of signals intelligence. Citizens were online exchanging emails, VoIP calls, browsing, and governments were able to hoover this traffic up and have no constraints apart from being able to process the traffic to stop them from viewing. And this trend only stopped in 2013 when Edward Snowden, a contractor at the US National Security Agency, disclosed government surveillance practices. All of a sudden, US companies in particular began robustly rolling out encryption, in particular end-to-end encryption, to stymie government access. Now, whether that was through purely altruistic motivations or because they wanted to preserve their access to foreign markets is largely unknown. Throughout this period, we also saw a number of other technologies developed to enhance privacy. The Onion Router, Tor, also known as the dark web, enabled users to access hidden resources and also for them to conceal their own locations. WikiLeaks was born, designed to allow leakers or whistleblowers to release information online whilst again concealing their own identity. Digital currencies, known as cryptocurrencies, evolved. Bitcoin in particular was popular. The idea of cryptocurrencies was to remove the central institution, so a bank, from the transactions. For instance, when I want to send some money to my brother, I tell the bank to send money to my brother, and the government can ask the bank about that transaction and get the information. With cryptocurrencies, there is no central authority. which means it can be harder to get information about that transaction, to identify the individuals involved, and potentially block any transactions. Security and privacy are often in conflict online, but they are not mutually exclusive. For instance, after 9/11, we were able to introduce more security on planes without diminishing privacy when we reinforced cabin doors. So it is not always the case that a little security must be sacrificed in order to get a little more privacy, and vice versa. There are many threats that we have to manage in cyberspace, including government overreach and surveillance, organised criminals, nation-state espionage and sabotage. The mitigations to these threats will be dependent on the risk appetite and culture of each society or government. And finding some form of balance between security and privacy is one of the biggest challenges of the digital era. Criminals have benefited in many ways from the birth of the internet. They can now operate a continent away from their victims with little chance of detection or extradition. It is the depth of distance that enabled criminal enterprises to scale globally. Whilst this was possible before, the tyranny of distance has always introduced constraints, most notably temporal and logistical. For instance, moving a drug shipment from Colombian rainforests to Western and Asian markets required not only weeks or months, but demanded complex and expensive supply chains vulnerable to interception or delay. The internet collapsed time and distance. Criminals could now target those on different continents instantly, providing their supporting technical infrastructure was established. Often these criminals are concentrated in jurisdictions with weak or corrupt law enforcement, such as Russia or Latin America. This often prevents their extradition when cybercriminals are identified. But given the inherent anonymity of the internet, identification is highly challenging. Many criminals are able to remain in the shadows for years. Yet with regards to attributing cyber operations, it should be noted that whilst a degree of anonymity is provided by the internet, sustaining this anonymity over a prolonged period of time requires significant skill and effort. Attribution is possible in many cases, especially when technologically advanced countries are attempting to identify those involved with an act. Cryptocurrencies have been adopted by criminals from early on in their development. They enable crimes like ransomware with minimal financial paper trails. The original criminal digital business model was to steal personally identifiable information, such as a user's credit card numbers. Credit cards were then cloned and given to mules, who would buy expensive items in shops and sell them on the black market to cash out. This process took a long time to execute and involved a lot of people, hence less profit and more risk. Extortion-based crimes were the answer. Previously, they had not been viable online as they left too much of a paper trail. However, cryptocurrencies diminished this problem. Whilst cryptocurrencies are not entirely untraceable, they are often incredibly hard to trace, especially when combined with expert operators and other technologies such as cryptocurrency laundering services. It is not only criminals that have benefited from cybercrime. North Korea, a state that has for generations been excluded from the international system, has moved into the cybercrime business at scale over the last decade. One of their most notable operations was the attempted digital heist of almost $1 billion from the Bangladesh Central Bank in 2016. They successfully stole 81 million, save for a few small errors, they would have stolen many hundreds of millions more. The United Nations assesses that North Korean hackers have successfully stolen billions of dollars via cybercrime, targeting banks and cryptocurrency exchanges to help to fund their nuclear weapons program. But it is not all good news for criminals online. Many of them moved towards what they believed was a secure communication system sold online. They bought specialist phones called EncroChat. These phones had a number of security features to prevent governments from spying on them. These phones cost several $1,000s and a subscription fee of around $600 a month. The problem is when a high concentration of criminals moves to a certain platform, it inevitably attracts the attention of law enforcement. Officers were able to gain access to the servers that controlled EncroChat and launch a coordinated worldwide operation in order to arrest all of the users of these devices. And the results that followed were some of the best in the history of criminal investigations. This slide shows some of the statistics. Over 6,000 arrests, 271 properties, 923 weapons seized, 83 boats, 40 planes seized as well. And these criminals that were investigated, the Europol officers commented, were often the top mob bosses, people that they could not get with normal investigative methods. So using what they believed was a secure communications platform had actually proved to be the downfall of these individuals. Intelligence agents have also made good use of the internet. The earliest case of espionage online traces back to the 1980s. In 1985, a group of German hackers was paid by the Russian KGB to break into US classified systems and try to steal data. And this is captured in a brilliant book called The Cuckoo's Egg by Cliff Stoll. And this book is very readable and not technical at all, and I would highly recommend it to anyone interested in this field. By the late 1990s, the Russians were directly operating online rather than through proxies. The Moonlight Maze intrusions were some of the first that were publicly attributed to a nation state. The Russians, as well as other advanced countries, were understanding that cyber was enabling industrial scale espionage with diminished risks. What is different about espionage in the digital age is the same thing that transforms the criminal world: distance and risk. Distance means that operations now have a much lower risk. Intelligence officers and spies are in danger of being arrested or sometimes killed when they are directly operating in foreign countries. Digital espionage does not require intelligence officers to be in their target country, and spies are mostly not required for cyber espionage. These factors combine with digital scalability. One operation could target tens or even hundreds of potential intelligence sources. Technologically advanced countries are known to invest heavily in cyber espionage, and by the early 2000s we saw the first evidence of Western operations in the Equation Group. By the end of the 2000s, cyber espionage capabilities were being privatized. Initially, such capabilities were constrained to countries with highly developed technology sectors: France, the UK and US, Israel, Russia and China. However, companies such as Israel's NSO Group, mostly made up of ex-Israeli military and intelligence personnel, commoditized the sale of cyber espionage technologies by selling their wares to countries all over the world. This privatization of espionage capabilities has contributed towards a proliferation of the number of countries with cyber espionage programs and made all of us less secure. By the early 2010s, Western intelligence agencies, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are all heavily invested in cyber espionage. In fact, NSA General Keith Alexander cites Chinese cyber espionage of intellectual property as the greatest transfer of wealth in history. Subsequently, the US Department of Justice released wanted posters of those Chinese intelligence officers they believe to be responsible. These officers are all based in China, so beyond the reach of US law enforcement. However, it is the first attempt of the US to try to deter such activities in the future. When cyber espionage is occurring so broadly, there is a risk that capabilities used by nation states are leaked online. This happened in 2017 when a group called the Shadow Brokers, a group whose identity we still do not know, leaked US NSA capabilities. The technical vulnerability that was leaked had been used by the NSA for around 5 years. Its code name was Eternal Blue. Once it was leaked online, the North Koreans were able to acquire it. They then used this capability to launch an attack globally. a destructive worm that caused significant disruption all over the world, including to the UK's National Health Service. Given the proliferation of cyber espionage capabilities, it is likely that such occurrences will happen again in the future. Now we turn to sabotage. From early on in the digital revolution, the potential for cyber sabotage was both feared and explored. By the late 1990s, hacking into foreign networks was becoming an established tool of national power. Governments accelerated research into cyber's military applications. The notion of a cyber Pearl Harbor became popular. Yet, little evidence existed to validate that a cyber attack with a serious loss of life or property damage was achievable. Despite this, funding drastically increased for cybersecurity, in part due to the disaster narratives that became dominant and were often fueled by Hollywood movies. The first known act of cyber sabotage occurred in 2010, when what is believed to have been a joint US-Israeli operation sabotaged the centrifuges at Iran's Natanz nuclear enrichment facility. Reporting indicates that cyber sabotage was decided as a potentially viable strategy as early as 2006 by the Bush administration. In part, this strategy was intended to appease the Israelis, who were advocating for military action to prevent Tehran from achieving a nuclear capability. It was hoped the non-kinetic operation would buy enough time for ongoing international diplomatic negotiations to constrain Iran's nuclear program. The Iranian Natanz network was air-gapped, which is to say it did not have any network connections out of the facility. This meant there was no internet at Natanz, and the US-Israeli attack could not be initiated remotely. Therefore, somebody was needed to help the malware, called Stuxnet, physically reach the facility. It is reported by a highly credible journalist, Kim Zetter, that Dutch intelligence recruited an asset with access to Natanz who plugged in the USB containing Stuxnet. Other reports have suggested that a Dutch agent installed the malware within a water pump that was subsequently installed at Natanz. However it arrived, the malware successfully reached Natanz and destroyed many of the centrifuges used by the Iranians for enrichment, whilst concurrently painting a false picture on their monitoring screens to slow the Iranian detection and investigation of the problem. Whilst the exact strategic impact of the malware is hard to measure, it is known that during the time period of the operation, the diplomatic accord limiting the nuclear program in Iran was signed. Some have estimated that Stuxnet slowed the nuclear program down by a year, whilst others are sceptical whether it had any impact at all. Whether the signing of the nuclear agreement was due to sanctions that had been wearing down Iran's resolve, because of Iran's potential desire to return to the international fold, due to Stuxnet impact, or due to a combination of factors, or even a different variable, is ultimately unknown. But for many, Stuxnet was a proof of concept that was viewed as at least partially successful and would trigger greater investment in cyber sabotage capabilities going forwards. In retaliation, the Iranians launched a wiper attack against Saudi Aramco, the biggest producer of oil in the world and a national economic champion of the Saudi government. A wiper attack deletes all of the content on a computer, and Iran were able to wipe out 30,000 computers worth of data at Saudi Aramco. Aramco scrambled to buy machines to replace those that had been destroyed, creating a temporary worldwide shortage of laptops. By the mid-2010s, the Russian military were embarking upon cyber sabotage. As part of their Ukrainian intimidation campaign, the Russians attempted to shut down a number of power plants. This was a move straight out of a Hollywood movie, the embodiment of fears such as those portrayed in 2007's Die Hard 4. The operation itself was largely unsuccessful. Despite managing to disable 60 electric substations providing fuel to 230,000 people in the dead of winter, the energy facilities were operational again within 6 hours. This highlights what is called the fragile, resilient nature of the systems running critical national infrastructures such as energy facilities. Whilst it is possible to cause initial disruption, such as temporary outages, using cyber-sabotage, it is much harder, though not impossible, to cause sustained effects via these types of operations. This is as critical national infrastructure are by their very nature designed for resilience. They are built to withstand natural disasters, operator incompetence and equipment malfunction. Often cyber-sabotage emulates such operational threats that have been drilled for, and response is practiced over a period of years by critical national infrastructure companies. A few years later, the Russians launched another significant operation against the Ukrainians. This was a further wiper attack known as NotPetya. The Russians attempted to limit the blast radius of NotPetya by installing it within a Ukrainian tax software. Their logic was that only Ukrainians would be using this software, which contained the hidden malware. However, many international companies had operations in Ukraine and therefore also used that software. When the wiper attack was executed, it spread all over the world, causing significant damage, including to national health services and global shipping. During the Russia-Ukraine war, cyber-sabotage has become business as usual. The principal question from a military cyber perspective is, what is cyber's strategic utility in times of war? Is there a role for conducting cyber attacks against a power plant when a missile can easily be used? Are there ongoing intelligence collection accesses that would have to be sacrificed for potentially temporary sabotage effects? At the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia used lots of wiper attacks. However, that is something that we do not see in early 2024. The current theory is that Russia realised that in order to conduct such sabotage attacks that cause temporary disruption, they had to sacrifice important intelligence accesses, and those accesses are now being favoured. We also continue to see cyber-sabotage being used as part of covert actions. For instance, a group calling itself Predatory Sparrow conducted an operation to attack an Iranian steel production site that was allegedly supporting the Iranian nuclear program in 2023. The attack caused significant damage to the facility, though whether it had any strategic utility is unknown. Let's now examine influence in the digital age. The powerful have always sought to influence others to achieve their goals. In geopolitics, this influence is sought first overtly through diplomacy, and secondly covertly through a number of vectors such as intelligence agencies recruiting spies and having them act in their interests. The digital revolution is now enabling industrial-scale covert influence operations. Coordinated inauthentic behaviour campaigns, such as agitation via hundreds of fake social media accounts, allow influence operations to potentially be more targeted and reach more people than ever before. This is moving influence operations from the periphery of state power to the centre. Yet, the evidence of online influence operations' efficacy is scant. This could be as we are not seeing the most effective operations, that we don't always have good ways to measure impact, or that the cultural barrier is not easily surmountable and operations are of low quality. Disinformation operations in particular have proved highly adaptable to the digital environment. Many influence or disinformation operations seek not to create new lines of conflict within a target society, but to exploit an existing socially divisive issue, such as immigration in the UK or reproductive rights in America, to impact the social cohesion of the target country. Russia in particular see disinformation operations as a critical method of asymmetrical warfare, with the ultimate aim of making a country ungovernable and thus neutralising its military. One goal of disinformation operations can be to not just project a single narrative in support of the aggressor's agenda, but to flood the information environment with conflicting counter-narratives, so that recipients start to believe that it is impossible to tell fact from fiction, causing their disengagement from the topic and potentially leaving more space for an adversary-favoured narrative. Such counter-narratives can typically only escalate into politics if the target population's trust in state institutions who can debunk such disinformation is low. Another form of influence online is coercion. Intimidation is intended to dissuade an actor from pursuing a certain course of action. For instance, in 2014, Sony Pictures were due to release a comedy movie called The Interview that depicted James Franco and Seth Rogen assassinating the North Korean President Kim Jong-un. The North Koreans warned Sony that they should not release the movie and called it a wanton act of terror and threatened merciless retaliation. When Sony refused to back down, the North Korean operation began. They broke into the Sony network, destroyed computers and servers, and stole large volumes of data. The North Koreans masqueraded as a fictitious hacktivist group called the Guardians of Peace and left a message on Sony computers. The message that appeared on desktops is shown here. It threatened that unless Sony capitulated, their data that had been stolen would be leaked online. Sony did not capitulate, and the Guardians of Peace then threatened physical escalation, warning viewers that they should not attend cinemas showing the movie, and if they had houses nearby they should leave. The next day theatres started reneging on their plans to show the film. Sony suspended the movie's release. There was uproar in America about foreign censorship of freedom of speech. The FBI publicly attributed the operation to North Korea. Obama criticised Sony for capitulation. The North Korean operation stopped around this point. The Interview was released in a limited number of theatres and online. The Obama administration later imposed new, mostly symbolic sanctions on Pyongyang. Analysis suggests the limited showing contributed towards a studio loss of $30 million for the movie, and Sony had to spend more than $40 million investigating and remediating the breach. Sony's stock price dipped 11%, and the attack destabilised Sony's leadership. The leaked emails that the North Koreans subsequently released showed that Sony systematically paid its female actors less than its male actors, and criticised well-known actors and made racially insensitive jokes about President Obama. The chairperson of Sony, considered the highest positioned woman in Hollywood, was subsequently fired. Was the influence operation considered successful by the North Koreans? They managed to impose significant financial costs on Sony, significantly diminished the number of people who saw the movie given the smaller release, destabilised the ability to govern of Sony's leadership, and introduced a deterrent for future studios considering similar movies, all at a fairly limited cost. It probably was considered successful. We now turn to terrorism. Terrorists were early adopters of technology that could aid them in recruitment. Al-Qaeda and later Islamic State created glossy pamphlets and YouTube videos advertising their cause, many with high production qualities. Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine, for instance, was first published in 2010 and was designed to inspire others to join their cause or to conduct lone wolf attacks. This was not just local advertising, as had mostly been the case in the pre-digital age when word of mouth and personal connections governed who was recruitable by terrorist organisations, but international recruitment and incitement. The digital era offers new financing and covert communications options. From as early as the 1990s, Islamist terrorists were experimenting with encryption technologies. In the 2000s, Islamists progressed to producing their own encryption software, Mujahideen Secrets. Released in 2007, it was essentially a proven open-source encryption program, PGP, in an Islamist wrapper, rather than a capability developed indigenously by Al-Qaeda. Digital technologies allow easier and more anonymous, though not entirely so, transfer of funds to terrorist organisations via cryptocurrencies. Though today terrorists don't tend to develop their own software, they mostly use available software that has either been developed by criminals or is used by mainstream society so they can hide in the noise. For instance, Telegram is particularly popular with terrorists. Terrorist cyber intelligence and cyber capabilities have thus far been ineffective. For the most part, they are constrained by users who are typically poorly educated on digital security. Cyber intelligence collection and cyber sabotage by terrorists is today considered a relatively low threat. However, Given society's rapid digitisation and digital literacy improvements, and with the increase in far-right terrorist activity, a different demographic and often more technological compared to the terrorist threats of the first 20 years of this century, terrorists will likely become more of a threat in the future within the digital domain. Whilst anonymity and privacy provisions of the internet may have offered some veneer of protection to terrorists, many would argue that digitisation has as many pitfalls as benefits for extremists. Government agencies have been able to use open source and signals intelligence to identify terrorists. They've been able to leverage the major technology platforms such as Google to provide them information on adversaries' accounts, essentially indirectly surveilling them and to close target accounts when necessary. Governments are also able to hack into digital devices and extract data on their targets and map their networks. They can also geolocate their targets via these devices and use this information to enable catch or kill operations against them. One case study we will quickly examine is Islamic State's kill lists. This is Junaid Hussain, a British national who joined Islamic State in Syria. He was a prominent recruiter and conducted hacking operations on their behalf. You can see one of his recruitment tweets here on the right. Hussain was able to access some personally identifiable information sent to him by another hacker who had broken into an e-commerce site. This e-commerce site included data on government officials and their locations to city level. Hussain published this information online, likely hoping that others in proximity to such individuals would be able to precisely geolocate them and launch an attack. Hussain was also believed to be involved with a hack against US Central Command's Twitter account, as can be seen here in the bottom right. Hussain would subsequently be killed by a US drone strike. It is not known whether he was geolocated by an attack against his devices. However, he was killed in the operation. And finally, we turn to future threats that we will face online. Synthetic media, or deepfakes, will make it harder to discern truth from fiction. Deepfakes found their early origin in pornography, as celebrities' heads were superimposed onto the bodies of pornographic actors. Whilst being harmful to the victims of such superimpositions, the impact to society was limited. Today, synthetics are quickly evolving to the point where they are challenging to discern from reality. Whilst there are legitimate applications of such synthetic technologies, such as in Hollywood and for medical patients who are about to lose their voices due to illness, there are many illegitimate applications. Synthetic audio has already successfully been used for criminality, when an employee was supposedly called by their CEO instructing them to make a financial transfer. The CEO was in fact an audio synthetic generated by artificial intelligence. There are profound implications for security and society when it becomes hard to trust what we can see with our own eyes, such as politicians making a statement. Artificial intelligence will likely cause significant capability advances, and it's very unpredictable how this will affect security. Vladimir Putin once said that whomever leads in AI will rule the world, and China has identified AI as an existential priority. The true potential of AI is unknown. However, we are already seeing extremely promising applications of a form of artificial intelligence known as machine learning. AI can enable optimization and acceleration of all manner of state capabilities, including espionage, sabotage, and warfare. Whether saboteurs or terrorists can cause physical harm to people or buildings remains a theoretical possibility. However, given our critical infrastructure is often supported by decades-old technology, and with new technologies coming online that interact with the physical world yet have poor cybersecurity, there are many who argue that it is a question of when, rather than if, such harm to people and property becomes a reality. And in the future, widespread national disruption could result from cyber operations. We're perhaps in the most geopolitically unstable period since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Strategic instability will likely be a persistent feature in the coming decades. To think of the digital and physical worlds as separate is becoming increasingly anachronistic as all parts of our lives, and soon maybe even parts of our bodies, become digitized. That means the scope for societal disruption from technology is significant. Not only do we have to worry about a general destabilisation of the digital ecosystem upon which we all depend due to pernicious, ongoing issues such as cybercrime, we have to keep in check our government's desires to surveil the population beyond that which is proportionate. We have to be concerned about nation-states using digital channels to influence their neighbours, stoking domestic conflicts, exacerbating international tensions, and creating a climate where any semblance of the truth becomes alien. We have to be aware of terrorists spreading their poisonous narratives to those most vulnerable in our societies. We have to be apprehensive about destructive cyber capabilities breaking the leash of their owners and wreaking digital chaos. And we have to worry that the era of great power conflicts upon which we are again embarking will travel through our digital networks to degrade, disrupt, deny access to, or destroy our critical national infrastructures. All of these factors combined could lead to widespread disruption of states. In summary, over the course of this lecture we have discussed the ongoing contestation between offensive and defensive forces in cyberspace. We've explored how the internet was not designed for security, and digital surveillance has become pervasive in this environment. We have introduced the concept of the death of distance. That is, that geographical proximity is no longer the same challenge to criminals, spies and terrorists as it was in the analogue era. And we've talked about cyber-physical systems and their fragile, resilient nature. We've examined influence at scale and noted how it is presently ineffective, but that may change due to the rise of artificial intelligence. And we've talked about generative AI that will make discerning truth ever more challenging. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you so much for listening. You can contact me over LinkedIn by searching for Craig Jarvis Cyber. Thank you very much. Hello, and welcome to this lecture on cybersecurity. My name is Craig Jarvis. I'm an international and cybersecurity researcher, a guest lecturer at Oxford and Royal Holloway, and I'm currently writing a book on cyber terrorism. This lecture is divided into 4 components. First, we will provide an overview into cybersecurity. We will then examine the offensive components, explore the defensive components, and finally summarize what we have learned. Let's get started. Cybersecurity is defined by the Cambridge Dictionary as things that are done to protect a person, organization, or country and their computer information against crime or attacks carried out using the internet. Put simply, it's about protecting digital assets, whether that be devices like iPhones or networks that are used in corporations, against malicious actors. And some would include service resilience within this definition. In part, that is down to the ransomware attacks that have been prevalent in our society since 2017, which has meant that as part of security against such attacks, we wanted to make sure that there were resilient backup systems in place. Now, let's look at the objectives that attackers are trying to achieve. Attackers could be seeking one or multiple goals. Their objectives may be financial, seeking to make money. They could be trying to steal commercial or national secrets for intelligence gain. They may be seeking to enact sabotage to disrupt, damage or destroy an adversary's infrastructure. Or coercion may be their objective, trying to modify the behaviour of an individual or group. Further, they could be attempting to support government positions with propaganda. It may not just be propaganda, but disinformation to distort the truth may be their objective. It may simply be that the attacker is looking for a challenge to stimulate their intellect, or they could be trying to build a reputation and develop notoriety within certain communities. They could be trying to gain revenge, enacting retribution against an individual or group, or they could simply be nihilist, attempting to instigate chaos within the digital arena. We will now move on to exploring the threat entities themselves and marrying each of them to their likely objectives. Threat actors have embraced digital and they recognise the opportunities that are delivered by anonymity, distance, speed and scale. And we are in an enduring offensive-defensive contestation between the groups we're about to explore and cybersecurity practitioners. The main 6 groups we're going to look at are nation-states, criminals, hacktivists, thrill-seekers, terrorists and insiders. Starting with nation-states, they are mostly intelligence and military organisations, although some do contract to academia and industry. They target foreign governments, industry, dissenters and opposition, and some countries, such as North Korea, generate revenue via cybercrime. They will also seek to influence domestic populations with propaganda and foreign populations often with disinformation. And you can see the mapping on the right hand side of the main objectives they pursue. Criminals operate globally, although they are concentrated in the former Soviet Union and in Latin America. They operate as businesses, often having HR, PR and R&D departments. They target industry, public sector and individuals. And extortion and financial fraud are particularly prevalent. There are also links to modern slavery. For instance, romance scams have been found to be operated by many people that are held against their will in Southeast Asia. Hacktivists are normally individuals or small groups. They can be state-directed, providing deniability for the nation-states, but often they are disparate groups. They target governments, industry and individuals, but do have limited impact. And thrill seekers are most often individuals, though they can be small groups, typically teenagers and 20-somethings, and they are often socially ostracised. They target big brands and high visibility individuals, though usually have minimal capability. Terrorists are often individuals or small groups, although they are sometimes affiliated with larger terrorist entities. They target governments, but again have minimal capability, and we mostly see defacements, denial of service and data theft. Insiders are almost uniquely individuals. They are often disgruntled, passed over for promotion, or have other similar motivations. Sometimes there is an ideological schism with their employer, and insider knowledge can give offensive advantage to these individuals. We now turn to the methods used by these threat entities as they seek to achieve their objectives. One of the most common attack types is denial of service. A denial of service, or DOS attack, works when a device or network is overloaded with traffic, causing it to fail. A denial of service attack may be launched by one machine, or it could be by many machines acting in coordination. This is known as a distributed denial of service, or DDoS attacks. DDoS attacks are often an expression of political dissent. They can constrain a target's communications temporarily, but have no lasting effects. Another form of attack that is often political is defacements of websites. A defacement will typically exploit some sort of technical vulnerability in order to breach a website, although the same can be achieved with stolen credentials. The attacker will then leave some sort of text or imagery on the website to convey their messaging. For instance, in 2020, the US assassinated Iranian General Soleimani. This was a significant geopolitical event in the region. And Iranian hackers defaced a US government site, the US Federal Depository Library Program. On the left you can see how the website normally looks, and the right you can see the version after the defacement. Historically, data theft has been one of the most significant problems in cybersecurity. Data can be stolen for a variety of reasons. For instance, attackers may ransom some stolen data, claiming they will release it online unless a ransom is paid. Attackers may steal data for fraudulent purposes. Typically, they try to acquire PII, or personally identifiable information. That is information that will allow them to create cloned credit cards that they can use on the black market, or apply for credit so that they can then buy things using that credit line that has been established, which has the secondary impact of destroying a user's credit rating. Or finally, particularly with political or ideological motivations, an attacker may steal information to leak in what is known as a hack and leak attack. These attacks may be facilitated by social engineering. This is when we are trying to get somebody to do something against their interests in order to further our interests. It often also exploits the good nature of humans. For instance, one technique is called a USB drop, and this is where an attacker drops a lot of USB keys that are laden with malware outside the organisation that he is targeting. A good-natured employee is hoped to pick the USB up and plug it into the corporate systems, allowing the attacker to get access. Another approach is spear phishing, where an email is sent asking the employee to click on a link or open a document that will allow the malware to access the target system. Attackers may not even use malware. They may be able to solely exist on legitimate network features. This is known as living off the land, and when they are not bringing malware with them, it can sometimes make it a lot easier to hide amongst the system noise. Another form of attack that has been particularly popular over the last few years are those attacks that manipulate individuals to directly transfer funds to an attacker. One flavour of this type of attack is business identity compromise. That is where individuals who are involved with financial transfers seemingly request a transfer to a different account. It could be that an attacker is able to execute an account takeover of somebody that is in the supply chain of a company and send that company an invoice claiming it is overdue and the payment must be made within the next 24 hours, or hence there will be a penalty fee. Another variant is the romance scams. These scams aim to fool victims into believing they are falling in love and send funds to a love interest who supposedly has some sort of dire need. It could be that they claim they have a family member who needs medical attention, or that they want to come over to visit their target and need the money for the airfare. These type of attacks are often supported by synthetic media, otherwise known as deepfakes. These are images and voices that can be generated by artificial intelligence in order to make the individual believe they are talking to a real person. For instance, the pictures on the bottom here are all generated with artificial intelligence. None of these pictures exist, and you can go to thispersondoesnotexist.com and generate your own pictures very easily here. Another variant we see using this sort of attack is that of the child in danger. This is where an attacker is able to clone a child's voice with artificial intelligence, creating a deepfake audio. They then call the parent and claim as the child that they are in trouble and need money transferring. This is something that we expect to become more prevalent as time goes by. And this sort of attack also falls into the category of impersonation. This is when a profile is adopted or created to enable an attack. We often see this in the help desk scam, which is when an individual receives a call from somebody claiming to be acting in their interests to either update their software or solve some other sort of problem. It ultimately results in either the victim giving access to their machine to the caller or transferring some sort of funds. We also see investment fraud in this way. An attacker could masquerade as a celebrity endorsing an investment. Elon Musk in particular is a persona that is adopted by attackers to encourage individuals to invest in crypto. However, this investment is framed as a give and receive, in that you have to give so much crypto in order to then receive a larger amount back in a set period of time. The attackers aren't actually investing, of course, they are sending their cryptocurrency to an attacker. And we also see profiles created in order to spread false information. For instance, during the US 2016 election, Russian state actors integrated themselves into a number of forums and social medias posing as US citizens. They were able to convince another US citizen to build a jail cage and have somebody play Hillary Clinton locked within it during a Republican event. They were paid $1,000 for their trouble. Resource theft is found most commonly in cryptojackers. This is malware that steals the CPU power of their victim and uses it to mine for currency, enabling the attacker to extract cryptocurrency and subsequently cash it out into fiat currency or real money. A lesser known use case of resource theft is stealing infrastructure to enable malicious activity. Attackers need to remain anonymous. To preserve that anonymity, attackers will route their traffic through a number of computers all around the world before reaching their final target. That means, if their attack is detected, identifying the route of the attack becomes quite challenging. In order to build this network through which the attacker can route their traffic, they may use pre-configured networks such as the Onion router, known as Tor. Or they may steal infrastructure from other targets. So for instance, they could first hack into home computers, home routers, corporate servers, and then chain all of these devices together so that they can obfuscate their location. Destructive attacks, often known as wiper attacks, typically are political or ideologically motivated. We most often see these attacks in theatres of war or between countries where there are latent hostilities. Sometimes destructive attacks are paired with attacks for financial gain. Ransomware is the principal example of this. With a ransomware attack, an adversary breaches a network or computer and then encrypts that network and refuses to decrypt it unless a often significant ransom is paid. These attacks have been particularly prevalent since 2017, and over the years businesses have invested significantly to make themselves more resilient. As a result, this has forced an evolution of the threat actors. Now, as well as encrypting the network, they first steal data from it. They then threaten to dump that information online unless a ransom is paid. This means that even if an organisation is able to recover from the encryption attack on its network, they can still be held to ransom for that potentially sensitive data that the adversary has been able to steal. We also see the extortion methodology applied to denial of service attacks. An adversary may threaten a potential victim with a denial of service attack unless a significant ransom is paid. Thankfully, corporate defences against denial of service attacks are reasonably resilient. Should you ever suffer a ransomware attack, you may be greeted by something like this on your computer. This is a screenshot from the WannaCry malware that launched in 2017, likely operated by the North Korean state. On the bottom you can see that this is a Bitcoin ransom and that the victim is to pay $300 worth of Bitcoin to a specified address. You can also see countdowns on the left of when the payment will be raised and when the files will be lost. Another prominent example of ransomware is that of 2021 against the Colonial Pipeline. The attackers were Russian and known as DarkSide. Colonial owned 5,500 miles of pipeline that supplied half of the US East Coast's oil. Their business systems were encrypted. However, the pipeline systems remained functional. As a precautionary measure, Colonial chose to halt the pipeline operations to prevent any potential spread of the ransomware to them. The attack caused oil shortages. 10,000 stations ran dry, and President Biden declared an emergency. There was a shortage of car and plane fuel. Panic buying occurred and prices spiked. The attackers also stole data and threatened to leak unless a $4.4 million ransom was paid. Colonial capitulated in order to prevent the release of their data and to have their systems decrypted. 5 days later, pipeline services resumed. Subsequently, the FBI were able to recover $2.3 million of the ransom, but the attackers remain at large. We will now pivot from the offensive aspects of cybersecurity to the defensive components. We will first explore how individuals can protect themselves. Then we will look at businesses and cybersecurity, before we examine cybersecurity strategy at a national level. The first consideration for individuals is whether they are maintaining the currency of their devices. That is, are the devices being regularly updated and are they supported by the manufacturer? If not, when new vulnerabilities emerge for that asset, it may be that patches aren't available. Where possible, auto updates should be enabled. Secondly, antivirus should be running. Antivirus works on the systems by trying to identify anything that is known bad or anything that heuristics, which is behavioral analysis, suggests may be bad. Thirdly, enabling multi-factor authentication is incredibly important. 10 years ago, we mainly just used a username and a password to access services. However, passwords can be easily stolen and reused by attackers. Therefore, we move towards multi-factor authentication, which is where you access a resource not just by using a password, which is something you know, but by also having a second factor, ideally something you have. Now, a common second factor is SMS messages. However, this method is broadly considered insecure and should be avoided wherever possible. Ideally, for services you use like your email, you will have a software or hardware token. A hardware token may be something like an RSA key that you plug into your machine to verify that you are who you say you are. A software token will be delivered via an authenticator app. This is generally the preferred way of second factor authorization when a hardware token isn't available. Developing digital common sense is incredibly important for cybersecurity. In the real world, we develop common sense throughout our childhood and early adulthood as we observe and analyse things that go on around us. However, in the digital world, it can take some time to develop this same sort of skepticism online. For instance, I recently released an article and the next day I received an email saying it was an excellent article that had been recommended for several awards and that I was to fill out some paperwork to be eligible. And whilst it's true this is incredibly flattering, I have to consider whether it is real. For instance, my article was 12,000 words long and would take several hours for anybody to read it. To be recommended for an award, you likely have to go through some sort of review panel with several parties involved. Could so many parties have been brought together so quickly to deem that my article was worthy of an award? So taking these factors, it seemed that this email was likely fraudulent, as turned out to be the case. And none of this analysis required technical expertise, it was just applying common sense to the digital environment. So it is recommended that whenever you receive something that you don't expect, whenever an offer seems too good to be true, that you approach it with skepticism. And the fifth recommendation is to monitor your financial assets. If you have bank statements arriving once every month, that is only one opportunity every 28 to 31 days to detect an ongoing attack. For instance, many years ago when I received statements in that cadence, I was targeted by an attacker who increasingly took money from my account posing as Deliveroo. Now, I use Deliveroo every few days. However, the attack was quite clever. It started off on day one of the attack by just taking a small amount, and the next day it took a little more, and the next day a little more. And by the time I detected it, the attack was taking £30 a day. Now, whilst in aggregate this was a relatively small loss that was refunded by the bank, I would have been able to instantly detect it had I had an application on my phone from the bank and was able to see my statements on a regular basis, ideally having alerts when money is spent. And this truncates the window of opportunity for attackers. It is also important to think about resilience of your personal finances. Do you have all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak? Is all of your money located in a singular account? It is best to spread your assets so that if one account is compromised, it is not likely that the entirety of your financial resources will be so. Dependent on your jurisdiction, you may be entitled to some refunds if you do suffer fraudulent activity and you cannot be shown to have been at fault. Many banks now warn you before you transfer money, but be aware that in this warning they often are putting themselves in a position where if you continue with the transaction despite their warning, they won't refund you. But all of this is important to be placed in context. Most people use the internet safely every day. It is an incredible enabler of all sorts of social goods, from education to scientific collaboration to staying in touch with friends and family. Whilst we should be cautious online, just as we are cautious in the physical world, we should not be afraid. Now we turn to securing businesses. The primary purpose of enterprises is profit, and this can create a tension with cybersecurity as it is considered a cost center and almost always reduces that profit. Cybersecurity in and of itself is not something you can sell on the market. It is something that all of your offerings must have where applicable, but most consumers don't look at cybersecurity as something that will be a differentiator in their purchasing decision. The individuals within an organisation that set the level of cybersecurity investment are those same individuals whose pay is closely linked to the business's profitability. They think about the quarterly returns and the annual profits. However, when they're spending more money on cybersecurity, they are diminishing those profits. That means they are also going to be receiving smaller bonuses. Therefore, the incentives for these individuals to invest on behalf of the business are somewhat skewed. Further, security is a long-term potential risk, and executives will often take a short-term view to prioritise profit. In a way, they are gambling that the risks they are creating or not resolving will not manifest during their tenure. Regulations try to compensate for these skewed incentives by introducing penalties for organisations that do not practice good cybersecurity. Public sectors face different challenges. They are often underfunded and cannot afford expensive technology and staff. They lose out to the private sector, who are able to pay scarce cybersecurity practitioners twice what they can. In 2017, I sat down with the chief surgeon who controlled 2 hospitals and 650 doctors. It was just after the WannaCry ransomware attacks that had caused significant disruption to his A&E departments. For 2 hours we talked about the threat of ransomware and how it could be managed. Their cybersecurity maturity was incredibly low. They had invested in healthcare capability rather than cybersecurity. As we discussed the threat and the countermeasures and what a 3-year cybersecurity transformation program would look like and cost, he put down his pen and looked at me. He said, "Craig, you're telling me this is going to cost millions. I have to decide whether I buy expensive technology or whether I put another 30 nurses on the ward over that period. And I have to work out where the greatest risk of harm is. Is it in not having those 30 nurses for this period? Or is it the potential harm that could come from having substandard cybersecurity?" It's an incredibly challenging dilemma. And in the public sector, they do often have to face these constraints that they have very limited resources and have to address the most significant risk. Often that has been judged not to be cybersecurity. Now, let's examine the panoply of risks that organisations must confront if they are breached. The first is response costs. If you lose sensitive data, including personally identifiable information of individuals, Then you will spend a lot of money in managing that situation. You are going to need an incident response team to do the technical components, including forensics and malware reverse engineering capability. Such consultants can often cost £1,600 a day. You will need lawyers, and potentially many of them. If you operate globally, you will be subject to different laws in different countries, and you need to make sure that you have met your responsibilities to each of these jurisdictions. You will also need monitoring. If individuals' personal identifiable information has been stolen and could be used for fraudulent purposes, then you will need to ensure that they are protected. And finally, you will need to consider compensation for the victims. Companies hold lots of sensitive data about all of us that can include things like health conditions, sexual orientation, and political beliefs. We have a right to privacy when it comes to such things, and when this privacy is compromised because a company has been breached, those individuals may have a right to compensation. This can be incredibly expensive for organisations, especially when a mega breach occurs. For instance, if a healthcare provider loses all of the records of its patients, this could be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of individuals that are impacted by the breach and the data loss. Even with a token amount of compensation, such as a few $100s, over that sort of scale, it becomes very expensive for an enterprise. Over the years, I've sat down with countless executives of large organisations to discuss their cybersecurity worries. And the main thing that comes out is that they are incredibly sensitive to brand damage. They don't want to suffer financial loss, but they would much rather privately lose money than to publicly be embarrassed. Such embarrassment can lead to media exposure. Mega breaches in particular are often covered in national press. And this in turn can lead to customer attrition. It can mean that organisations have to spend large amounts of money for brand restoration purposes. And further, it can lead to decision makers losing their jobs. This, of course, is a particular concern for the executives. Revenue loss can occur as a result of several factors. As well as having to pay response costs, there is direct revenue loss from the malware. This occurs in particular with disruptive malware, such as wiper attacks or ransomware, which can incapacitate an IT system. If such systems are incapacitated, the business may not be able to function, and for every hour it is not functioning, there will be significant financial costs as they cannot generate profit. For instance, if an organisation's point of sale system is taken down, for instance a supermarket, and they cannot take clients' money, then they are losing those sales for every minute that passes. Further, when we have complex systems, it may be that as a safety precaution when such an attack is launched, those systems have to be shut down in order to protect them, again incurring revenue loss. This is particularly prevalent within the manufacturing centre, where if we see an attack occur, many manufacturers may take the decision at the first sign of an attack to shut down that system so that the malware can't reach it. But when a factory isn't functioning, it is not producing goods and generating profit. And further, all of those resources still have to be paid, such as the personnel in the factory. We talked earlier about the unaligned incentive models with regards to executive decision making in cybersecurity investment. Regulations are in place to try to remedy that challenge. If an organisation is breached and a subsequent investigation finds that they were operating substandard cybersecurity, they can be subject to significant fines. The process of interacting with the regulators and other authorities is also incredibly cumbersome. Regulators will want extensive details of the organisation's security posture, of their people, process and technologies. They will want to understand the root cause of the breach and what the remediation actions are going to be. These actions may have to be agreed with the regulator, and the action plan may span several years, during which the regulator will want to be continually updated and receive evidence that the agreed actions have been implemented. Now we turn to how enterprises protect themselves. Organisations calibrate their defences around the pillars of protect, detect, respond and adapt. First of all, they want to protect themselves to prevent breaches occurring. But organisations do accept that the current state of the art in cybersecurity says that if an adversary has sufficient resources and sufficient time, they will eventually find some form of weakness that allows them to access the enterprise. Therefore, we have to have a robust capability to detect adversaries once they are inside the network. And following that logic, we need to be able to respond to those breaches, to understand their impact and expel the attackers. And finally, we need to study what went wrong and adapt our defences, ensuring that the attackers can't get in using the same path again. Now let's dig into each of those pillars in more detail. Firstly, protect. We operate to a series of security principles. The first is zero trust. This is a philosophy that says we treat the inside of our network with the same caution as we treat anything on the outside. This means we are always expecting that an attacker may have gotten in, and just because a device is within our network, we do not trust that an attacker has not already compromised it and may be seeking to move further within the enterprise. We follow the principle of least privilege. We make sure that employees only have the relevant permissions within the network to do what they need to do. This means if you're someone working in HR, you won't need to be able to delete databases wholesale, although you may need permission to delete individual records within that database, for instance, if an employee moves on to a new role. We adhere to the concept of defence in depth. We never rely on a singular security control. We have layers of security controls, which means that if the adversary is able to circumvent one of those controls, there's another one waiting to catch them, and another one after that. This gives us resilience within our enterprise. And our final principle is secure by design and by default. This is articulating that security should be baked into the very foundations of the designs of the assets that we use. For instance, if a manufacturer is building thousands and thousands of identical routers, they should not all have the same default password. Instead, each device should have its own unique and strong password. Ideally, it should be changed on first usage, and this should be suggested proactively to the user rather than relying on them reading the user manual and then going in and changing the passwords themselves. Another component of Protect is user education. We need to ensure that employees are developing that sense of digital common sense that we talked about earlier in this lecture. Technical controls are how we enforce our security principles. Firstly, patching. We have to make sure that any vulnerabilities that are identified are able to be remediated and in a timely manner. The function of the firewall is to ensure that only devices that are authorized can speak to one another. Firewalls may also have the ability to inspect the traffic that are passing through them for security purposes. Firewalls are normally placed at the edge of a network, such as the perimeter between the organization and the broader internet, ensuring that only those authorized on the outside can speak to devices on the inside. And firewalls are also placed within the organization itself between different segments of the network. Antivirus tries to prevent malicious activity on the asset it is protecting. For instance, it may have a library of files that it knows are potentially bad, and if it sees these files, it may prevent their execution. It can also search for bad activity using heuristics or behavioral analysis. That is, if action A, B, and C all occur within a certain time frame of one another and in a certain sequence, it may consider that this has a high likelihood of being malicious and prevent the ultimate activity. Data loss prevention technologies sit at the edge of the network. They scan outgoing traffic for signs of data that should not be egressing the network. For instance, they may be looking for confidentiality markers, or they could be looking for credit card numbers. Where such data is detected, it is prevented from leaving the network. Enterprise networks are normally segmented into a number of smaller subnets. The idea here is to contain the blast radius, so if an attacker is able to access one of those subnets, they are not able to easily move to another and cause even more damage to the network. The least privilege principle we talked about earlier aligns closely to the technical controls of identity and access management. We need to ensure that people only have the accesses that are required to do their jobs. When they leave their roles, their accesses are terminated. Or if they move within the business, they are given the new accesses they need to be successful, but also the accesses they no longer need from their previous job are terminated. Audit provides a second line of defense for cybersecurity. They ensure that all of the first line of defense, those implementing the technical controls, are doing their jobs correctly. And they provide a view on the risks. Which ones are they happy with in terms of the vulnerabilities in the network versus the cost it would take to fix them? And which ones do they want to mitigate, sometimes at significant expense? There is often also an independent audit capability to ensure the organisation is not marking its own homework on a permanent basis. There are a number of validation activities that take place as part of the Protect pillar. Vulnerability scanning makes sure that there are no vulnerabilities, or at least no known vulnerabilities, within the network. Simulated spear phishing ensures that employees are developing digital common sense and where they need a little more help are getting it. Penetration testing or ethical hacking is a way of checking that systems have been secured. This often happens as part of product development, but also can be a standalone activity that is conducted annually. Penetration testing typically involves hiring some external specialists to try and hack a device. Cyber attack simulations go a step further. Threat intelligence helps identify which adversary may attack the organization. They then research the tactics, techniques, and procedures that adversary uses and emulates them as part of an attack on the business. Often cyber attack simulations have very specific goals, such as stealing R&D information or launching a wiper attack. We will now move on to the Detect pillar. Before we architect any defenses for a system, it is critical to understand what threat it is we are defending against. The first stage of understanding who our adversaries may be is understanding who we are. What assets are our crown jewels? And what may we have that an adversary could be interested in? Once we understand this information, we can start to create a threat landscape for our organization. We can then examine the capabilities each of these threat actors has and architect our defenses accordingly to diminish risk. Intelligence sharing is also critical, especially within your vertical. So if an organisation works in the financial sector, it should be talking to other organisations in the financial sector to understand potential threats. And enterprises should always be looking towards the horizon. Architecting cybersecurity is a process that takes months and years, and accordingly, we need to be looking out to the future to what the threats are we will have to manage within that time frame. Anomaly detection is crucial to identifying adversaries. Not only do we look for known bad patterns that may indicate a malicious actor's presence, but we look for anomalies within the network. Firstly, we baseline what normal looks like. For instance, we may baseline the behaviour of all HR employees. What times of the day are they active? Which assets do they talk to? And then we will seek deviations within this dataset that may be indicative of a malicious actor. We will also have canaries in our coal mine. We will set digital tripwires so that if an adversary does come into the network, we have ways to detect their presence. For instance, We could place canary files around the enterprise. These would be files that should not be accessed by any legitimate users. So on the occasion they are accessed, this can serve as a potential alert to an adversary's presence. The beating heart of Detect is the Cybersecurity Operations Center, often known as the CSOC or SOC. This is a team that often operates 24/7, and they are responsible for triaging any security alerts that come in from the multitude of technical defenses around the enterprise. If they find something that looks suspicious, they will escalate it to the response capability of the business. Threat hunting is an elite level capability within an enterprise team. It has only become mainstream within the last 2 to 3 years. Threat hunting aligns closely to the assume compromise doctrine. If we work on the basis that there may always be an attacker in our network, it makes sense that we would go hunting for them. The hunting team created a hypothesis based on threat models, trying to work out who may be after us and what would they be after, and if they were able to get towards that goal, where may we find them within our network? The hunters then conduct a number of technical analyses to try and identify the presence of malicious actors and trigger the response capability. Incident response is the emergency service of cybersecurity. Their job is to investigate a breach and to coordinate the business and technical response. Within the response pillar, they are supported by the forensics team, who will conduct surgical investigations of potentially breached assets, as well as the malware analysis team, who will dissect any malware used and create countermeasures and detections. At a certain stage of the investigation, it will become necessary to evict the attacker from the network. A mitigation team will come together, comprising incident responders, forensics, malware analysis, and a number of business and technical associates. Their job, in a highly coordinated manner, will be to remove all aspects of the attacker's presence and to close off as many tactical accesses as they may have been able to open. For instance, if they have taken over or have learnt the password to accounts within the business, those accounts will all need to be reset so the adversary cannot regain access. And finally, remediation will be necessary to fix the root causes of weaknesses that allowed the attacker to gain access. This remediation may take a few weeks, months, or even years. To be successful, all of these capabilities across protect, detect, respond, and adapt must act in concert and be fully sponsored by the business they are protecting. Whilst all enterprises are under threat, there are a group of companies that we consider within the high threat club. These are critical national infrastructure entities such as energy providers, government institutions, and financial authorities. When considering additional security controls, there has to be a consideration towards the security versus usability trade-off. Sometimes increased security is justified by a heightened threat, and employees will have to learn to accept the usability constraints, and maybe even services become slower and less efficient as a result of the heightened security. Such controls may include air-gapping the business network, that is ensuring there are no connections between the enterprise network and the internet from where most threats originate. Increased staff vetting could be used, and a high security configuration could be deployed, such as Apple's lockdown mode on its iPhones, which remove some functions but increase security. And finally, we turn to national defense. Countries face a number of risks that must be managed in cyberspace. Firstly, political. In order to be successful, governments must keep information confidential, such as their diplomatic communications. Secondly, economic. Governments depend on revenues from a healthy economy, of which the internet is a core part. Thirdly, critical national infrastructure, on which governments depend to deliver services to their citizens. Equally, the military is highly reliant on digital systems. Should they be degraded, the military's performance would equally be degraded. and societies need ways to stay connected for myriad reasons. So countries are highly reliant on the internet in the 21st century, but what can they do to help ensure its health? The most important step, perhaps, is national defensive coordination and acceleration. During the 2010s in many countries, numerous agencies were involved with cybersecurity, which meant the activities were poorly coordinated. Today, most countries have some sort of national cybersecurity centre in order to coordinate their activities to defend the nation. Such centres should be trying to accelerate the capabilities of the country, in particular around ensuring there is a pipeline of cybersecurity capability and talent in order to defend the nation successfully. Forging intelligence sharing alliances is also critical in cybersecurity. Talking to other countries allows you to understand how they have been targeted, to exchange indicators of compromise that may help you detect the adversary if they try to operate within your borders. And when breaches do occur, a country needs a mature law enforcement capability in cyberspace. They also need supporting legislation so that attackers can be brought to justice. However, many attackers are smart enough to operate in regions beyond the jurisdiction of those countries that they target. In such scenarios, governments have few options. One of those remaining is the use of offensive cyber. That is when government employees hack back into those who are hacking against their country. They may then seek to disrupt the network with that access, or to even destroy the machines and servers responsible for the operations against them. Finally, nations may seek to build international alliances and agreements. This goes beyond normal intelligence sharing on a tactical basis and moves to integrated operations targeted often against common threats who pose the most challenge to those countries within the alliances. Now we move to the summary. This lecture has articulated the growing dependence that societies have on the internet. There are numerous threats that populate cyberspace, and we are in the midst of a constant offensive and defensive battle that is unlikely to subside within the coming years. There is complexity in defense, which is why breaches are still so often within the news. And offensive capability can help us defend our organizations and countries. This marks the conclusion of this lecture on cybersecurity. Please follow me on LinkedIn, where you can find me under Craig Jarvis Cyber, and thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to this Anatomy of Hacking lecture. My name is Craig Jarvis. I'm an international and cybersecurity researcher. I split my time between academia, where I'm a guest lecturer at Oxford, Imperial College and Royal Holloway, as well as writing a new book on cyber terrorism, and industry, where I work as a cybersecurity specialist. This lecture will provide an overview of hacking and step through each of the stages that attackers have to go through in order to pursue their overall objectives. Let's start with a little background on hacking. Hacking culture originated at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known as MIT in the United States, where a hack was considered a project undertaken or built not solely to fulfill some constructive goal, but with some wild pleasure taken in mere involvement. To qualify as a hack, the feat must be imbued with innovation, style, and technical virtuosity. As you can see from that description, hacking had nothing to do with breaking into computer systems or causing damage. It was about exploring a new digital environment that had opened up to humanity. Today, a hack is defined by Cambridge Dictionary as getting into somebody else's computer system without permission to do something illegal. However, there are contexts in which hacking is legal. The most common is when system owners decide to test their own networks by hiring ethical hackers, otherwise known as penetration testers, to try to break into their networks in order to proactively identify vulnerabilities that can be fixed before a real attacker arrives on the scene. Governments also conduct hacking, often known within their communities as computer network exploitation, or CNE.
Today, there are tens of thousands of people with hacking skills. The picture at the bottom here shows the main cybersecurity conference known as Black Hat and held in Las Vegas every summer. Tens of thousands of attendees are usually present as the latest and greatest technological innovations are explored and the security implications analysed. So what are attackers after when they hack into your devices? If you think about your personal phone, your work laptop, or corporate servers, there are a wealth of opportunities. Our professional and personal lives are mediated by digital devices. This means attackers can learn a lot about us and our corporations. For instance, a target can be profiled. The sum of all the data points on those devices can paint a rich picture of the individual or their organization. This picture is painted with insights derived from the target's emails, files, chat messages, and it's not just data that already exists on the device that may fall victim to the attacker. The camera and microphone may be remotely activated, allowing the adversary to eavesdrop on phone calls, video conversations, and corporate meetings. It is important to remember that when a device is compromised, it is not a one-time view of that device. If the attacker is able to persist, they can see what is going on into the future, perhaps in near real time. Once that access is gained, attackers can use it for more than intelligence acquisition. They could try to sabotage the device, either disabling, denying, degrading, or destroying the technology. With all of that access to information, what are hackers' ultimate goal? While some are seeking financial gain, this isn't just citizens and criminals, but also governments such as North Korea. Others are looking for commercial or national secrets. Some will be seeking sabotage. This is not only criminal groups like ransomware that encrypt machines so they can't be used until a ransom is paid, but also governments who may be seeking some sort of disruptive military objective. The rich array of data available may allow an attacker to coerce or blackmail their victim. And propaganda is also an objective to support government positions. Hackers may be acting as part of a disinformation campaign, or it could be that an attacker is purely seeking challenge to stimulate their intellect in the way that perhaps we did crossword puzzles a generation ago. They may be seeking notoriety to build their reputation within the hacking community, or they could be looking for revenge. Perhaps an employee has been fired and wants to cause pain to his previous employer. And some may be nihilistic, simply seeking to instigate chaos, although thankfully this is rare. We will now examine the kill chain framework. This was created by the defence contractor Lockheed Martin in 2011. Cybersecurity is steeped in military language. Of course, when it comes to hacking, there is very little killing that goes on. Despite that, we use the phrase the kill chain to describe a hacking action. This military language reflects the prevalent role within cybersecurity of the US Department of Defense and defense contractors in hacking and security from the 1990s through to the present day. Let's step through each of these stages and give a high-level overview before we dive deep into the details. First, the attacker must identify and profile their targets during the reconnaissance stage. They then prepare their attack and send it to the target. The attack then executes, and the malware is installed within the target environment. This allows the attacker to establish their initial foothold, almost like a digital beachhead. With this access achieved, the malware must then call out to command and control. These will be digital assets owned by the attacker, such as servers or domains. Once that communication has been achieved, the attacker will be in control of the victim machine.
The attacker will then seek to expand their access, moving around the target network. They will install multiple redundant communication pathways, so if their primary channel to command and control is compromised, they do not lose overall access to the target environment. And finally, the attackers will move on to action on objectives. This could be stealing data or encrypting machines and holding them ransom. We should also note that there are other attack frameworks as well as the kill chain. MITRE has one that goes into more detail, as can be seen here in this graphic, and the unified kill chain offers a more cyclical path over 3 separate stages. The kill chain is used during this presentation as it is perhaps the simplest and the most widely known, and will allow those who view this lecture to converse with the most people and gain a basic understanding before they look at these more advanced kill chain models. With the initial overview now complete, we will start examining each of the kill chain stages in more detail. Reconnaissance involves identifying targets that can allow the attacker to meet their objectives, then doing the analysis to understand how best to attack them. Adversaries will want to profile their targets. When seeking to exploit individuals, they will want to know what the target's interests are, where do they work, who do they know, and to what information do they have access. This allows the adversary to craft a customized attack to their target. For instance, if their target is a sailing enthusiast, they may use social engineering within an email attachment to try to get the target to open it. This is a common effect that we see happening every day and often with high levels of success. If the target is a company, the attacker will want to know what is their unique selling point, who do they employ, who are the customers and suppliers, where are the company offices, what is in the news about them, and what do their communications typically look like. The totality of this information is incredibly valuable to an attacker. Not only does it help them assess whether their objectives may be met by breaching this target, it allows them again to customize their attack. This ensures that there is the highest likelihood of success. As well as understanding the context of the company or the individual, attackers need to understand the technical profiles of those entities. There are 2 main methods of doing this. The first is passive. Such techniques do not suspiciously interact with the target, potentially triggering their defenses. Using third-party data to identify target infrastructure, for instance, would be one example. Active techniques are different. They interact with the target, discovering its assets and scanning to identify vulnerabilities. The danger of such techniques is that the target may detect the attacker's reconnaissance. However, such scanning occurs constantly online. It is likely that the attacker's activity would get lost in the general noise of the internet. Access credentials may also be sought on criminal marketplaces. Historic breaches often leave credentials exposed and available online. It could just be that the attacker is lucky and happens to find some credentials that give them easy access into the target environment. We now turn to the weaponization stage. Trying to breach the target environment often involves social engineering, which is tricking a user into facilitating malicious activity by acting against their own interests. Attackers often try to create a sense of urgency. Popular lures include password resets, missed deliveries and tax rebates. The example to the right shows an attempt by the Russian military intelligence to gain access to the systems of Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. They sent this spearfish with social engineering to John Podesta, a senior Clinton official. As you can see, the subject is "somebody has your password." This would inculcate a sense of fear within the target, and they would quickly want to do whatever they could to recover their account. There is an option to change the password, which it is hoped the target will click on. In this case, it is believed that Podesta did click on that link. The Russian military intelligence were able to infiltrate the networks of the presidential campaign and subsequently steal more than 50,000 emails, which would in turn be posted to WikiLeaks. During social engineering, The attackers are trying to get the targets to often do one or multiple of four things. It may be they want the target to click a link or to download a file. Perhaps they want the target to open an attachment and enable potentially malicious content, such as can be seen here with an Excel macro on the right hand side. Or, as in the previous example, they may be trying to trick the user into entering their access credentials, usually as part of a fake login or a change your password attack. Yet, not all attacks require social engineering to be successful. Sometimes systems are found to have vulnerabilities, and specific technical exploits can be developed in order to exploit those vulnerabilities and gain access to the underlying system. Some attacks will require multiple exploits to enable the attacker to breach the perimeter network, move laterally, and achieve their objectives. In other cases, exploits won't be required at all. The attacker may be able to abuse legitimate system tools, such as PowerShell, to achieve their objectives. This has the benefit of allowing the attacker's traffic to blend in with normal network noise. Further, attackers don't have to rely on their own malware, which, when they bring it into the system or use it within the system, could be detected by the Security Operations Center. Attackers may use one of three types of exploit. Where there is a patch available for the exploit, that is a security fix, it is known as a patched NDA. Once the patch is deployed, the exploit should no longer be able to cause harm to the system. An unpatched NDA is when a vendor is aware of the vulnerability, however, they have not yet deployed a security fix. And finally, 0 days. This is an exploit that is unknown to the vendor, and therefore there are no patches available. While 0 days get a lot of media coverage, the truth is, most attackers use exploits that are known, and even exploits that have a patch available. However, enterprises are often inconsistent in their deployment of these patches. This leaves a window of opportunity for the attackers. Nearly all parts of the kill chain can be outsourced. There is a rich criminal market providing an array of services. For instance, when an attacker is seeking initial access to their target, they may use initial access brokers who are able to conduct the primary breach into the network, set up redundant access methods, and then sell those accesses on the criminal markets. However, when attackers use such partners, they do lose some operational control. Such services online allow lower skilled actors to punch above their weight. We now move on to the delivery stage of the kill chain. During delivery, the malware is sent to the target. Attacks may be directed against one or many users, machines or networks. However, the attacker does have to weigh the detection risks. If they send the same spear phishing email to 50 users in a company, that will likely be detected, whereas if they send an email to one, it is more likely their attack will evade detections. An alternate route would be to exploit a vulnerability, which could negate human facilitation altogether. And delivery may also be media-based, such as flash drives distributed at conferences or scattered in a company car park. Now, let's look at exploitation. We've already talked about exploits, and in this stage, they are executed against their targets. This may be a software or a hardware vulnerability that they are exploiting. Some attacks, such as account takeovers, do not require malware. If attackers have been able to procure valid credentials, usernames and passwords on criminal forums, they may be able to simply log in to the target's account for their initial access. We now turn to the installation stage. During this stage, the malware is installed on the target device. One of the first things that malware is usually programmed to do is to add additional persistence methods to enable it to survive detection. This means if the Security Operations Center finds the malware
and deletes it, there is still a way for it to regenerate itself and to contact the attacker. Malware will also likely download additional modules with further capabilities, such as keyloggers. As mentioned earlier, today many attacks do not use malware. Living off the land allows them to utilize existing software, and it makes detection and forensics significantly more challenging. We now move to command and control, also known as C2. Attackers need to be able to communicate with victim devices. Typically, malware must initiate the communication from within the target network. This is because external communications instigated by the attacker would likely be blocked by network defenses. Attackers will attempt to conceal their location to avoid being traced. The pathways of victim communications must facilitate this objective. Attackers will often route the traffic through compromised devices, such as home routers, or through the dark web, also known as the Tor network. Attackers may also use well-known services such as Instagram, Facebook to blend in with normal network traffic and smuggle their communications out of the network undetected. Attackers will then propagate through the network. This involves escalating their privileges to provide more powerful accesses. It must be remembered that every attacker action is a detection opportunity for the SOC. Attackers will attempt to make their actions as efficient as possible with a minimum series of steps to achieve their objectives, thus minimize detection likelihood. And finally, we look at action on objectives. Every other step in the kill chain has been to reach this point, the operational goals of the attackers. That may be to steal or destroy data, to disrupt services, to steal currency or enact disinformation. The attacker may then start to think about covering their tracks. They will conduct actions to erase the traces of their activity, such as removing or tampering with security logs. They may even go to the extreme of deploying a destructive malware, such as a wiper or ransomware, to further obfuscate their activities. However, it may be that the attack is not a one-off operation. It could be that the adversary seeks a persistent access to the target environment, meaning that they will always be there until detected, or they otherwise decide that the environment can no longer meet their operational goals. It is important to accentuate that hacking is not necessarily a quick activity. It can take months or even years to achieve complex objectives, and often when attackers try to rush the process, they increase the likelihood of detection. Over this lecture, we have discussed how hacking is a complex activity. Social engineering is often required to facilitate compromise. Attackers use multiple persistence methods, making expulsion hard. Criminal marketplaces can allow attackers to punch above their weight by providing some capabilities. And hacking often takes extensive time, and sometimes stealth can be sacrificed for speed, but that increases the detection risk. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this initial overview of hacking. Please feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. You can find me by searching Craig Jarvis Cyber. Thank you. Hello, and welcome to this lecture on hackers. My name's Craig Jarvis. I'm an international and cybersecurity researcher. I split my time between industry, where I work as a threat intelligence analyst, and academia, where I lecture at several universities and am currently writing a book on cyber terrorism. The agenda for this session takes us from the very inception of the hacker culture through to hackers today. Let's get started by exploring how hackers came to be. Hacking culture originated at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Stephen Levy wrote a brilliant book called Hackers in the 1980s, where he described that a hack was considered a project undertaken or built not solely to fulfill some constructive goal, but with some wild pleasure taken in mere involvement. To qualify as a hack, the feat must be imbued with innovation, style, and technical virtuosity. Note that nowhere in Levy's description does he talk about criminality as being part of hacking, and it was not part of the early conception of the culture. Hacking was not then, nor is now, a monoculture, and there have been changing perceptions from the public's perspective over the last 50 years. Today, many in the public would perhaps consider hackers to be criminals, those who break into systems and steal things that don't belong to them or cause disruption or destruction. This pursuit of technical virtuosity was pursued in the 1950s, where hacking evolved at MIT's Tech Model Railway Club and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And when we talk about a model railway, it is not as we perceive today. For instance, these screenshots show room-sized apparatus with sophisticated electronics. It was an area where the engineers could experiment with new technologies. The hackers enjoyed lockpicking, safecracking, and accessing anything forbidden. Their targets included computers, phone networks, model trains, university steam tunnels. However, it is important to recognise that the culture then meant the hackers had a doctrine of doing no damage. They were hacking into these assets for the intellectual challenge rather than with some malicious aim. They needed to know why the targets were off limits, what hidden knowledge was harboured on those unknown shores, and what cerebral somersaults would be required to achieve their goals, and how would success make them a better hacker. Hackers would crawl through ceiling spaces to circumvent locked doors, always trying to find imaginative solutions to the problems they were trying to solve. In another example, on one occasion, a new, supposedly 24-hour pick-proof safe was delivered to the university, with the unlock code arriving separately. The hackers had it open in 20 minutes, long before that code arrived at the university. By 1976, Joseph Weizenbaum, a professor at MIT, wrote this of the computer bums, as he called them. They are bright young men of dishevelled appearance, often with sunken, glowing eyes. They can be seen sitting at computer consoles, their arms tensed and waiting to fire their fingers, already poised to strike at the buttons and keys on which their attention seems to be riveted as a gambler's on the rolling dice. When not so transfixed, they often sit at tables strewn with computer printouts, over which they pore like possessed students of a Kabbalistic text. They exist only through and for computers. He went on to say that they work until they nearly drop 20, 30 hours at a time. Their food, if they arrange it, is brought to them. Coffee, cokes, sandwiches. If possible, they sleep on cots near the printouts. Their rumpled clothes, their unwashed and unshaven faces, and their uncombed hair all testify that they are oblivious to their bodies and to the world in which they move. These are computer bums, compulsive programmers. So you can see the early depictions of hackers that were picked up by Hollywood are reflected in Weizenbaum's words. A particular area of focus for the young hackers was hacking the phone system. The practice of phreaking refers to the hacking or manipulation of the phone system. The term phreaking came from the word frequencies, and the hackers in turn were the freaks. The freaks would reverse engineer the in-band system signalling tones used by the phone service to operate the system. Emulation of certain frequencies, which could be achieved sometimes by something as simple as a cheap whistle, could allow the system to be fooled into thinking a legitimate command was being sent, and give hackers free access to functionality such as long-distance calls. Freaks would call around the world without having to bear the cost. They would often gather on one particular line at a fixed time to chat, joke, and exchange their findings. They would also play pranks by dropping in on the established calls of people they knew or even celebrities. This practice ended by the 1980s, when the telecommunications companies transitioned to out-of-band signalling, meaning the frequency emulation sounds that the freaks were making were no longer of any use. Two particular individuals were responsible for some of this freaking activity in the 1970s. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who later in 1976 would found Apple, built illegal blue box freaking kits in 1972, which can be seen on the right here. It was the first digital blue box, an innovation. Each unit took a day to build and they sold them for $170 each. They sold between 40 and 100 units, according to their varying recollections. They stopped their illegal business after almost being arrested when they were pulled over by a police officer who examined the devices. Jobs and Wozniak claimed that it was a music synthesizer, and thankfully the police took their word for it. There was also a poor return on investment due to the extensive time it took to build each unit. We now move on to the hacker principles. These were captured by Stephen Levy in his seminal book Hackers, released in 1984. The first hacker principle is that access to computers and anything that might teach you something about the way the world works should be unlimited. Always yield to the hands-on imperative. This principle emphasizes that hackers were not theorists, they were practitioners. They would not spend a long time trying to theorize how something may work. They would get their hands onto a computer and start trying things. Often they would explore without having a particular goal in mind or only a vague destination towards which they were travelling, with the idea that they wanted to create space for exploration and discovery. The second principle is that all information should be free. The hackers didn't believe in any barriers that would stop them from learning. The third principle was that authority should be distrusted and decentralization promoted. Hackers saw figures of authority as gatekeepers to technology and knowledge, and they preferred that they would have direct access to those resources. The fourth principle was that hackers should be judged by their hacking, not bogus criteria such as degrees, age, race or position. This was a very egalitarian philosophy, especially given it was in the 1950s and 60s. However, it should be reflected that most of those early hackers were relatively affluent, coming from the middle class. They were male and they were white. It was only in later generations where access to expensive technology would be democratized. The fifth principle was that one can create art and beauty on a computer. Programmers saw their practice as a fundamentally creative one. And finally, computers can change one's life for the better. We will now move to analysing the first philosophical document of the hacker community that we will examine in this lecture. It is entitled The Conscience of a Hacker and is also known as the Hacker Manifesto. It was written by Lloyd Blankenship in 1986. Blankenship had been inspired by the 1966 science fiction novel entitled The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, in which a lunar colony revolts against Earth's absentee rule. At the time, Blankenship was 21, and he later reflected that he wanted to show that hackers were not just criminals. This was particularly important at the time, as War Games, a movie, had recently been released that showed hackers as a potentially malign influence on the world, bringing it to the brink of nuclear apocalypse. The manifesto would appear in the hacker magazine, Frack, which was one of the most important cultural staples of the community at the time. We will now analyse the document and try to draw out the main themes. Blankenship writes, "I made a discovery today. I found a computer. Wait a second, this is cool. It does what I want it to do. If I make a mistake, it's because I screwed up, not because it doesn't like me, or feels threatened by me, or thinks I'm a smartass, or doesn't like teaching and shouldn't be here. Damn kid, all he does is play games. They're all alike." So you can see here the first paragraph is from Blankenship's perspective, whilst the second is from his teachers. And if we look at the themes here, first you can see that of discovering a new world, and a technology as a liberator. You can also see persecution for intelligence. And Blankenship goes on. And then it happened. A door opened to a world, rushing through the phone line like heroin through an addict's veins. An electronic pulse is sent out. A refuge from the day-to-day incompetencies is sought. This is it. This is where I belong. I know everyone here, even if I've never met them, never talked to them, may never hear from them again. I know you all. When we examine the themes, we can see addiction, and we can see an intellectual home or sanctuary being provided to Blankenship. Damn kid, tying up the phone line again. They're all alike. You bet your ass we're all alike. We've been spoon-fed baby food at school when we hungered for steak. The bits of meat that you did let slip through were pre-chewed and tasteless. We've been dominated by sadists or ignored by the apathetic. The few that had something to teach found us willing pupils, but those few are like drops of water in the desert. Again, we can see the recurring theme of persecution for intelligence. That Blankenship felt intellectually starved and also intellectually superior to those around him. And this sense of persecution recurs throughout this document. This is our world now, the world of the electron and the switch, the beauty of the board. We make use of a service already existing without paying for what could be dirt cheap if it wasn't run by profiteering gluttons, and you call us criminals. We explore, and you call us criminals. We exist without skin colour, without nationality, without religious bias, and you call us criminals. You build atomic bombs, you wage wars, you murder, you cheat, and lie to us and try to make us believe it's for our own good, yet we're the criminals. Again, you can see similar themes emerging. Technology as a liberator, discovering a new world, an artistic component, and that of intellectual exploration. You can also see persecution, morally corrupt authorities, and the institutionalized and restricted use of technology. We then see the professed egalitarian and impartial nature of hackers, and again persecution and morally corrupt authorities as themes emerging. Blankenship continues. Yes, I am a criminal. My crime is that of curiosity. My crime is that of judging people by what they say and think, not what they look like. My crime is that of outsmarting you, something that you will never forgive me for. I am a hacker, and this is my manifesto. You may stop this individual, but you can't stop us all. After all, we're all alike. Again, we see themes of persecution and intellectual exploration coming through. Egalitarian and meritocratic, intellectual superiority, the hacker community, and an irrepressible evolution. And bringing this thematic analysis together, we can see that the challenges highlighted by Blankenship include institutionalized, restricted technologies, morally corrupt authorities within society, and that the hacker community is being persecuted for intelligence beyond that of normal people. Hackers are seen as addicts in a way. They are artistic and have a sense of community. They are discovering a new world as intellectual explorers, and they are intellectually superior whilst also being starved of intellectual stimuli. And the internet is painted as an egalitarian and impartial environment, where an intellectual home can be found for those within the hacker community, a sanctuary from the real world. The internet is depicted as being part of an irrepressible evolution of society, a meritocratic environment where technology acts as a liberator. The Hacker Manifesto continues to have cultural resonance today within the hacking community. It is quoted in the 1995 movie Hackers, which itself was a cultural icon of the community. It appears in the 2010 movie The Social Network, which charts the evolution of Facebook. You can see it here on the right. And it is also referenced in Edward Snowden's autobiography.
However, a rebuttal can be made against the conscience of a hacker. For instance, in breaking into servers and exploring or perhaps copying data, property and privacy laws are ignored. Would hackers allow intruders into their homes if no damage was caused? Blankenship also does not consider that some data should remain secret and private within society, for instance military information or private medical records, and that hackers' actions may have unintended consequences. For instance, if hackers use resources on a server they have broken into, then perhaps time-critical processes will not be able to complete in time, causing a subsequent impact. The conscience of a hacker also glamorizes hacking culture, portraying the hacker as the hero, and this fails to recognize that hacking is not a monoculture. While some may be explorers, others could have criminal, disruptive and destructive intent, and how would defenders be able to differentiate between those different types of hackers? And also, some hackers may be intellectually superior, but others may be successful due to a high boredom tolerance and weak defences of their targets. Further, in building a new world for the intellectually superior, the hackers could be building a prejudicial environment similar to the one that they were themselves trying to escape, as those that are not as intellectually capable as the hacker community would be excluded. And in professing to be an egalitarian community, Blankenship doesn't recognise that technology access in his era in the 1980s was mostly limited to middle and upper class people, and they were almost exclusively white men. Blankenship himself seems to meet these criteria. And there are further criticisms, such as Blankenship accusing society of lying and cheating. Deception is also paramount to hacking in social engineering. Governments of liberal democracies that are criticised are elected and have legitimate mandates, however imperfect those processes may be. And Blankenship's manifesto could be perceived as a legitimisation of hacking without articulating limits on what is considered unacceptable behaviour within the ethos. This could lead young hackers to believing they have carte blanche to do whatever they want online without any consequence. The conscience of a hacker also contributes to the perception that the internet is insecure and may have slowed business adoption. We now progress to the 1990s and to the cypherpunks, a group of political hackers whose philosophies continue to have resonance today. The cypherpunks believed that encryption could stop state cyberspace regulation. Their interests included anonymity, whistleblowing platforms, cryptocurrencies that could potentially prevent taxation by the state, and encryption without any government constraints. They built technologies and advocated to advance their vision. A mail list served as the hub of cypherpunk activity. They had a wide range of influences. From a political perspective, they were mostly libertarianism or anarchists. They adopted the hacker ethic, and many came from the counterculture. They were also heavily inspired by science fiction, literature and film. It was books such as George Orwell's 1984 that represented a manifestation of what they feared could become of the world as the digital revolution unfolded. And there were several philosophical documents that formed the basis of their movement. The first we will look at is the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto. First written by cypherpunk leader Timothy May in 1988, crypto-anarchism was the philosophy that technology can mediate communities based on consent rather than coercion. The belief that technological enforcement of non-coercion rather than political agreements offers the best chance of sustaining consent-based societies. We will now explore the text. May wrote, "A spectre is haunting the modern world, the spectre of crypto-anarchy. Computer technology is on the verge of providing the ability for individuals and groups to communicate and interact with each other in a totally anonymous manner. Interactions over networks will be untraceable. These developments will alter completely the nature of government regulation, the ability to tax and control.
The technology for this social and economic revolution has existed in theory for the past decade. The methods are based upon public key encryption. The focus has until now been on academic conferences in Europe and the US, conferences monitored closely by the National Security Agency. The next 10 years will bring enough additional speed to make the ideas economically feasible and essentially unstoppable. The state will of course try to slow or halt the spread of this technology, citing national security concerns, use of the technology by drug dealers and tax evaders, and fears of societal disintegration. Many of these concerns will be valid. Crypto-anarchy will allow national secrets to be traded freely and will allow illicit and stolen materials to be traded. An anonymous, computerized market will even make possible abhorrent markets for assassinations and extortion. Various criminal and foreign elements will be active users of CryptoNet. But this will not halt the spread of crypto-anarchy. Just as the technology of printing altered and reduced the power of medieval guilds and the social power structure, so too will cryptological methods fundamentally alter the nature of corporations and of government interference in economic transactions. We can see in this manifesto that many of the trends that May prophesied in the 1980s have come to pass, such as the prevalence of extortion and even to some degree markets where acts of physical violence can be procured. However, his ultimate vision of citizens liberated from the coercive powers of the state has not become a reality. Whilst we have seen technologies such as cryptocurrencies become more popular amongst investors, they have not broken into mainstream society and are generally too volatile to be used as a primary trading currency. We have also seen steps from governments around the world to circumvent the anonymity features of the internet, to ensure they can continue to exercise a monopoly of force over their citizens. This is especially true of autocratic nations. We will now look at another key cypherpunk document, the Cypherpunk Manifesto. Written by Eric Hughes, another co-founder of the cypherpunks in 1993, the year that the cypherpunks came together, it reads, "Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. Privacy is not secrecy. A private matter is something one doesn't want the whole world to know, but a secret matter is something one doesn't want anybody to know. Privacy is the power to selectively reveal oneself to the world. Privacy requires cryptography. We cannot expect governments or faceless organisations to grant us privacy out of their beneficence. We must defend our own privacy if we expect to have any. The technologies of the past did not allow for strong privacy, but electronic technologies do. Cypherpunks write code. We don't much care if you don't approve of the software we write. We know software can't be destroyed, and a widely dispersed system can't be shut down." So the cypherpunks had a heavy priority on cutting code, not just advocating for political change, which they did do to some degree, but they preferred to leave that sort of activity to digital NGOs like the Electronic Frontier Foundation that were emerging around this period. They got involved in a number of different projects, such as electronic remailers to try and help build anonymity provisions online, and encryption software such as Phil Zimmermann's PGP, which became very popular around this time amongst the heavily technological community. The philosophies espoused by the cypherpunks continue to have resonance today. We now progress to the mid-90s, to the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. Written by libertarian John Barry Barlow when he was 49 years of age, the Declaration would become a seminal work. Barlow was a co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which advocated for and provided legal assistance to those it perceived who were having their rights curtailed in the emerging digital sphere. Barlow was also a lyricist for the Grateful Dead rock band. Barlow was later referred to as perhaps the most high-profile member of the Digerati on the planet by a prominent journalist. Whilst attending Davos, a gathering of the world's most powerful politicians and business leaders, Barlow realised he had a pending article deadline. He had just spent days listening to politicians claiming to understand the internet, yet he believed they had no genuine comprehension of the cyber domain. It was in response to this, and the US government's attempts to enact what Barlow perceived as censorship and control online, that he wrote the declaration. His principal argument was that cyberspace was immune to the sovereignty of governments. The declaration would be replicated on hundreds of websites. We will now conduct a thematic analysis. Barlow wrote, "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel. I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." We see a number of themes prominently emerging. The juxtaposition of antiquated governments and the discovery of a new world that is cyberspace. We can also see hackers finding a home and a sense of intellectual persecution as they prophetically ask on behalf of the future to be left alone. Barlow continues, "We have no elected government, so I address you with no greater authority than that which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear." We start to see a strongly libertarian theme emerging within the declaration. We see the perception that authorities are morally corrupt, and that an intellectual sanctuary is being found by the hackers. Barlow continues, "Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You have neither solicited nor received ours. We did not invite you. You do not know us, nor do you know our world. Cyberspace does not lie within your borders." And again we see cyberspace drawn out as a new world and technology as a liberator. Continuing, "You do not know our culture, our ethics, or the unwritten codes that already provide our society more order than could be obtained by any of your impositions. You claim there are problems among us that you need to solve. You use this claim as an excuse to invade our precincts. Many of these problems don't exist. Where there are real conflicts, we will address them by our own means. We are forming our own social contract." Again, we see the libertarian influence. "We are creating a world that all may enter without privilege or prejudice accorded by race, economic power, military force, or station of birth. We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity." Again, we see the egalitarian nature of hacking drawn out by Barlow, as well as that of absolute freedom of speech, that technology is a liberator, and the digital world is impartial. Barlow continues, "We must declare our virtual selves immune to your sovereignty, even as we continue to consent to your rule over our bodies. We will spread ourselves across the planet so that no one can arrest our thoughts. We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. May it be more humane and fair than the world your governments have made before." Again, we see the recurring theme of technology as a liberator, but also for the first time the recognition of corporeal subjugation, that whilst the mind may be free in cyberspace, the body continues to be under the jurisdiction of governments of the world. We also see the theme of morally corrupt authorities returning. When we bring all of this together, we see the challenges articulated as morally corrupt authorities, persecution for intelligence, corporeal subjugation, antiquated governments, and societal ostracism. Hackers are characterized as being discoverers of a new world, intellectual explorers, and prophetic. And the internet is classified as being egalitarian, impartial, an intellectual home that technology will liberate this community, that the internet will be libertarian and absolute freedom of speech will be allowed for. And when we add the view of the Hacker Manifesto themes, we start to see some commonalities. Those in green are the features that appear in both documents, that of morally corrupt authorities and being persecuted for intelligence, that hackers are intellectual explorers discovering a new world, and that the internet is egalitarian, impartial, an intellectual sanctuary, and technology will be the liberator of this community. We also see some differences. For instance, Blankenship in 1986 had talked about the institutionalised restriction of technology, yet by the mid-90s this was not mentioned by Barlow, a challenge that perhaps time and the economics of scale in producing computers had removed. There are a number of critiques that can be made about the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. For instance, the internet is much more diverse than Barlow portrays, with interested parties including not only individuals, but also academic, business, militaries, and wider government entities. Barlow's writings do not express the interests of these parties, many of whom are necessary for the economic sustainability of the internet. Nor does he properly address how the internet would self-govern to address the social harms that may emanate from the digital domain. Barlow also fails to explore that the physical infrastructure of the internet, including the users themselves, do lie within the jurisdiction of the world's governments. This means that the supposed immunity from sovereignty will always be constrained by governments who can coerce service providers, destroy equipment, or arrest users. Several academics have been highly sceptical of the Declaration. For instance, in 2002, Handon Sandwell stated, "Where IT have been singled out as a key cause of progressive change and democratic enlightenment, we not only have an instance of ideological simplification, but also an advanced form of technological fetishism." In 2004, Schofield stated, "The internet is not a cyber nirvana or the new home of mind. It is rather the new utopia for liars and thieves who will happily empty your bank account and who stand almost no chance of getting caught." By 2004, Barlow recognised the need to re-engage with governments, as he started to understand that their influence could not be avoided in cyberspace. We now move on to the 2000s and the emergence of hacktivism with Anonymous. Hacktivism's roots go back decades, though incidents were mostly isolated until the 2000s. One of the earliest worms was that of Worms Against Nuclear Killers in 1989. It deleted files and changed the passwords of machines that it compromised. NASA, the US Department of Energy, and CERN were all impacted. The attackers' motivations were possibly linked to the Atlantis shuttle launch. There were fears that if it exploded, plutonium from the payload would contaminate Florida. In the early 2000s, Anonymous emerged. It was a decentralized brand under which hacktivists gathered. There were few or no leaders, but some organizers for operations. There were also different branches. Many were transitory and operation-based. It emerged on the 4chan message and image boards, where 90% of users were anonymous. And it targeted those perceived as violating Anon's conception of morality. That is, targeting those it believes are suppressing free speech, are abusing their power or violating people's rights. Early attacks were accompanied by physical activism. However, most operations now are exclusively digital. Iconography is particularly important from Anonymous. You can see on the right here their logo, often appearing wearing Guy Fawkes masks. Here are some of their memes. They are designed to help bring together the community, but also to articulate their core philosophies, such as the inability of governments to ban ideas even if they can arrest the individuals who propagate them. There were many conflicts within the early Anon community, in particular whether their group should focus on hacking to entertain themselves, for the lulz, or for activist purposes. There were different perceptions of the group. Were they freedom fighters of the cyber age, or a digital mob? When targeting or making threats, Anonymous invoke their slogan, "We are anonymous, we are legion, we do not forgive, we do not forget, expect us," to promote a sense of foreboding and fear. The slogan often concludes the videos they make announcing their operations. Typically these feature dramatic oratory and text-to-speech voice disguises. Their operations are mostly limited to simple denial-of-service attacks, though in the early years such techniques were often successful, even against big, supposedly well-protected brands. Today, there are some defacements, disruptions, and hack-and-leak operations. States have been known to false flag against the Anonymous brand. For instance, Anonymous Sudan is widely believed to be controlled by the Russian state. An early Anonymous operation was that against the Church of Scientology. In 2008, the Gawker blog had posted a video of Tom Cruise praising Scientology. The latter issued a cease and desist letter to Gawker alleging copyright violations. Craig Horsch issued what was the first anonymous declaration video, announcing Operation Chanology. Horsch had been a software pirate in his 20s until he was jailed. He emerged from incarceration and became an Anon. His video accused the church of internet censorship. His words went viral. Anons came together to launch denial-of-service attacks against church websites, fax black pages, and make prank calls to their offices, and to leak church documents. The digital activity was accompanied by physical protests. Around 7,000 Anons protested outside church locations and other meeting points in more than 90 cities around the world. They wore Guy Fawkes masks, inspired by the movie V for Vendetta, to protect themselves from feared retaliation from the Church of Scientology. Here you can see photos from those protests. Let's now look at Operation Payback. In 2010, after WikiLeaks published 250,000 stolen US diplomatic cables, several companies refused to provide financial services to the site, starving it of the donations needed to operate. Anonymous believed the US government had put pressure on the financial companies to force WikiLeaks to remove the cables from its website and name its source. Anonymous launched Operation Payback, a denial-of-service attack against the financial companies. Several sites were temporarily taken offline, including those of Visa and MasterCard. Anonymous distributed a tool known as the low-orbit ion cannon to its users. The tool was easy to use, with the target domains or IPs simply needing to be entered into the tool to generate the attack. You can also see here a Twitter feed associated with the operation as the organisers coordinated their efforts. In a final anonymous example, in 2011 the cybersecurity company HP Gary claimed to have infiltrated the Hacker Collective. They claimed they would reveal confidential details of the organisation and the supposed leader's identity at an upcoming conference. In retaliation, Anonymous breached and defaced HP Gary's website, disrupted the company email and phones, hacked and leaked 68,000 emails and destroyed files. Anonymous also found and leaked a HB Gary strategy to destroy WikiLeaks. Finally, the CEO Aaron Barr's supposed address and phone number were leaked on Twitter. You can see here the defacement against HP Gary's website. As you can see, it is humorous whilst also being threatening. The message ends with a familiar, "We are anonymous, we are legion. We do not forgive, we do not forget. Expect us, always." We now move on to hackers today. As was stated earlier in this lecture, hacking is not a monoculture. Its culture remains diffused amongst numerous subgroups. It is much easier to develop skills as a hacker today than in previous decades. Video game hacking offers one entry point, and increased digital literacy and online tutorials make hacking much more accessible, rather than being perceived as a branch of the dark arts by those who are not practitioners. It is also easier to get lured into criminality. The barrier for entry into cybercrime is much lower, with a criminal ecosystem configured to exploit not only elite hackers, but those considered novices or noobs. Yet, there are plentiful and bountiful career paths available to hackers who wish to conduct only legal actions. Hacktivism has also become more prominent, with an activist generation motivated by issues ranging from censorship to climate change. It is worth spending a moment more to address the linkage between hackers and criminals. It is true that hackers can earn a lot of money conducting illicit activities. Hollywood often depicts hackers and criminals as being synonymous. Yet, the non-criminal hacker community may not consider criminals as true hackers, the latter being a term of veneration earned after years of striving for technical virtuosity, whilst at the same time not causing damage to people or property. Some security professionals start as criminal hackers whilst they are young. Where possible, it is a preferable response to divert these young offenders towards a cybersecurity career, rather than criminalising them at a young age, potentially curtailing their subsequent professional opportunities and increasing the likelihood of their earning a living in the illicit economy. Besides, industry desperately needs the talent. Today, there is an immense demand for hacking and cybersecurity skills. Hackers can work as white hats or penetration testers to test a company's defences and advise them of how to become more secure before a malicious hacker attempts to break into their organisation. Salaries for penetration testers are very competitive, and they are vital for the overall health of the digital ecosystem. It is possible that a subset of penetration testers may choose to supplement their legitimate incomes with illegal activities. However, with the investigative capabilities of law enforcement having significantly increased in recent years, it is likely that most will not see such activities as in their financial interests. This is before we even consider whether hackers would consider illegal activities to be morally and ethically justifiable. It is also possible that during times of geopolitical crisis, or when confronted with what they consider injustices, hackers may use their skills on behalf of the causes in which they believe. Not only seasoned hackers, but the general population can engage in hacking today. Further, there are hacktivists and cyber militias that can channel and support those wishing to conduct politically motivated hacking. We have seen a resurgence in this type of activity over the last 3 to 4 years as society has increasingly digitised. However, the impact of hacktivists has, as far as we can assess, been limited. The techniques used are mostly entry-level and easily defeated. For instance, during the Israeli-Hamas war, hacktivist groups such as the Ghosts of Palestine have attempted DDoS attacks against Israeli targets, yet they have been almost exclusively ineffective, except against the most minor of targets, and even then the effects have been short-lived. However, given the fog of war shrouding cyber actions in both Ukraine and Russia, as well as the Middle Eastern conflict, it is possible that we will have to reconsider this assessment as we learn more about what has transpired within these conflicts. To summarise some of the key points from this lecture, hackers are a diffuse community. They have a long history and some were and are apolitical. Today it is easier than ever to learn hacking, reflecting the increasing digitisation of society and a lowering of the barrier to entry. Despite Hollywood-mediated perceptions, hackers and cybercriminals are not the same thing, despite the overlap in skills. True hackers pursue technological virtuosity without intentionally harming society in the process. And hacktivism has become much more common in recent years, yet the strategic utility of such actions remains unclear. That concludes this lecture. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn to learn more about my research by searching for Craig Jarvis, Cyber. Thank you.